She thought she could control everything, even my home. But when HOA Karen used a spare key she wasn't supposed to have, she didn't know I was already 10 steps ahead. What she found inside wasn't just shocking, it changed everything. The neighborhood had always been a quiet place. Families looked out for each other, lawns were trimmed, and every holiday brought front yard decorations and potlucks on the cul-de-sac. Things changed the moment Karen became president of the HOA. At first, it seemed harmless, just another retiree who wanted to be involved. She handed out flyers for community garage sales, started a newsletter, and talked about protecting property values. But soon, her involvement turned into control. She began citing homeowners for minor infractions: a misplaced trash bin, a slightly faded mailbox, a flower bed that extended 2 inches past the approved boundary line. Her clipboard became a weapon, and her smile was often followed by a warning letter or fine. Karen seemed to target certain homes more than others, and mine became her favorite. She knocked on my door one morning to tell me my mailbox post was slightly leaning, though it had stood perfectly fine for years. A week later, I received a warning about the color of my curtains not aligning with the neighborhood aesthetic. Then came notes about excessive grass height, though my lawn was mowed every weekend. It became clear she wasn't managing the community, she was policing it. I tried to brush it off. After all, getting into arguments with HOA presidents usually only made things worse. Most of my neighbors either ignored her or pretended to agree just to keep the peace. I decided to do the same, until things got personal. I started noticing subtle signs that someone had been around my property while I was away. A gate left open, a patio chair slightly moved. A garden gnome turned to face the door instead of the street. At first, I blamed the wind or neighborhood kids, but it kept happening. One day, I came home early and found Karen walking slowly past my side yard with a clipboard. She didn't see me pull into the driveway. When I called out her name, she jumped slightly and forced a smile. "Just doing an exterior visual," she said. "Routine stuff." She pointed to her notes and told me she'd observed some potential issues with my fence paint and wanted to avoid filing a violation if I could touch it up. That night, I reviewed the HOA guidelines. Nowhere did it give the president or any board member authority to inspect private property without notice, and definitely not to step onto it uninvited. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA, but since Karen also ran the board meetings, it went nowhere. The minutes simply noted resident concern received and resolved. The next day, I found a warning letter in my mailbox about having unauthorized landscaping modifications. It's my crime? Adding 2 new potted plants on my front porch? I was fed up but careful. I didn't want to give her more reason to escalate. Started keeping records, logging every interaction, and taking pictures of my yard and property. Then something happened that pushed things too far. I was at work one Tuesday when my neighbor texted me asking if I'd come home for lunch. I replied no, and he followed up with a photo current standing at my front door, then bending down near the flower pot, retrieving something, and unlocking my front door. My blood ran cold. I had never given her a key. The only place a spare key was kept was inside the HOA's emergency lockbox. It's meant strictly for fire or medical emergencies, and only accessible with board approval. I hadn't authorized any entry, and there were no emergencies. She had simply taken it upon herself to let herself into my home. When I got home that evening, nothing looked out of place from the outside, but the energy inside was wrong. A drawer in my kitchen was ajar. A window in the back bedroom was unlocked. My office chair was slightly rotated, and my computer mouse had been moved. Karen hadn't just walked in, she had snooped around. I felt violated, like someone had walked through my private space and left a trail of invisible dirt behind. I immediately called the HOA and demanded an explanation, but once again, it was brushed off as a misunderstanding. Karen claimed she thought she heard a noise from inside my house and was just checking for safety. There was no record of an emergency, no permission. Just a woman who believed her title gave her the right to do whatever she wanted that night. I changed my locks. But I also began planning something bigger. I was done playing defense. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored, and it wasn't just about me anymore. If she was bold enough to enter my home without permission, she was bold enough to do it again or to someone else. and the next time she let herself in, she would not find an empty house. The violation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Every corner of the house felt tainted, as if Karen's presence had seeped into the walls. The very idea that someone used a key meant for emergencies to snoop around inside a private home wasn't just a breach, was a calculated abuse of power. The next morning, a sense of unease followed every step through the house. Checking drawers, closets, and cabinets became routine. Nothing appeared stolen, but that didn't matter. What was taken was peace of mind, and that was harder to replace than anything tangible. Attempts to escalate the complaint through the HOA were useless. Karen sat at the head of the table during board meetings, and the rest of the members either feared confrontation or owed her favors. When pressing for answers about the unauthorized use of the emergency key, the board responded with vague apologies and called it a simple misunderstanding. No disciplinary action, no formal apology, just a warning that any further hostile or disruptive behavior toward HOA officials would be documented as resident misconduct. Neighbors started talking. Some whispered about similar experiences: doors slightly ajar, misplaced items, unexplained visits, but no one had hard proof. Karen had become too comfortable in her role, too confident that she was untouchable. Her reign of entitlement wasn't enforced with aggression, but with the suffocating weight of authority she assumed was hers by right. And if no one could prove anything, she stayed safe behind the cloak of bureaucracy. The more she went unchecked, the bolder she became. Another notice arrived in the mailbox that week, this time about unsecured garbage bins posing a health hazard. The bins were exactly where they'd always been, tucked neatly against the side of the house behind the fence. Another manufactured violation used as a tool to harass and intimidate. Each warning was a reminder that she had access, she had power, and she was watching. But what she didn't realize was that while she watched others, someone had started watching her. The decision to set a trap wasn't impulsive, it was necessary. No amount of documentation or complaints would work against someone who controlled the system. Only hard evidence would bring accountability. Home security became the top priority. Cameras were installed, discreet, high definition, and placed in strategic locations, inside and outside the home. They recorded continuously, backed up to encrypted cloud storage with instant mobile access. A second lockbox was added near the front door, a decoy placed just within view. The real one, holding updated spare keys, was moved to a private location. Every inch of the plan was meant to anticipate Karen's next move. A few days passed without incident, but the pattern was clear. Karen always struck when the house appeared empty. Lights off. Mail uncollected, not on the curb. A neighbor was enlisted to monitor activity from across the street. The car was parked a block away. Smart lights were disabled. The illusion of absence was carefully crafted, designed to be tempting enough to bait her back. Confidence was high that she'd return. Her previous visit wasn't a one-off, it was a test, and she'd gotten away with it. Why? People like Karen thrived on boundaries that bent under pressure. They pushed until someone pushed back. This time the line wasn't going to bend. It was going to snap right in front of her. The weekend passed quietly. Then came Tuesday. Notification buzzed on the phone motion, detected near the front door. A figure in a familiar cardigan approached the entryway, glanced around briefly, and bent down toward the lockbox. The spare key she had no right to touch was used once again. The front door opened, and Karen entered like she owned the place. Within seconds, she began wandering through the home. Cabinets opened, papers sifted, doors pushed. She didn't look for danger, she looked for secrets, for something she could hold over someone else's head. Every second of her unauthorized entry was recorded, time-stamped, stored safely away. A call was placed to local law enforcement with a simple message: a trespasser is inside the residence. Caught on camera, caught red-handed. The trap was working. Her arrogance had become predictable. This wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming control. Every violation, every lie, every excuse had been building to this moment. Karen had believed herself immune to consequences, convinced her role gave her immunity. But the reality was beginning to shift. The law didn't serve HOA presidents sit, protected homeowners, especially from those who used their authority like a weapon. The wait for police confirmation felt long, but everything was unfolding as intended. By the time Karen realized the situation was turning against her, the evidence was beyond dispute. What had begun as a silent invasion of privacy was transforming into a case of unlawful entry, all backed by indisputable visual proof. Karen had turned the HOA into her personal playground, a place where rules only applied to others. But now, she had walked straight into a documented crime, orchestrated by her own arrogance. The plan had worked, and the foundation for real consequences had been laid. The trap wasn't just sprung, it was locked tight. Karen's confidence grew from silence. The silence of neighbors too tired to fight, the silence of a board too passive to challenge her, and the silence of victims who assumed justice wouldn't serve them. She relied on that silence every time. She crossed a line. But the moment she walked through the door with that stolen key, everything changed. The silence ended, and in its place came preparation. The plan was crafted with precision, built on patience, and driven by principle. She had to be caught in the act, not just accused. One accusation could be twisted, one complaint could be ignored. But video proof, that couldn't be spun. The setup began with small details. Smart locks were replaced with reinforced manual ones. Every entrance was outfitted with motion-activated security cameras compact, nearly invisible, and wired to upload footage directly to the cloud. Cameras were also placed in the hallway, living room, and office, any space she might snoop. And the goal wasn't to just catch her entering, but to capture her actions inside, prove intent, and eliminate any doubt. Multiple angles ensured every step was documented. Additional motion sensors triggered silent alerts to a dedicated phone. The audio recording feature captured her voice, her excuses, and her reactions. There would be no gaps, no deniability. Decoy spare key was placed in the original HOA lockbox, an exact copy of the one she had used before. That lockbox was never officially assigned or authorized anymore, but remained installed purely for bait. The real key was secured off-site. Her behavior was predictable, her entitlement consistent. She believed herself to be above suspicion, which made her the easiest person to trap. The house was staged to appear vacant. All smart lights were turned off remotely. The thermostat was raised to mimic someone being away on vacation. Curtains were drawn halfway, giving the impression that no one had been home for days. The mailbox was allowed to gather a few pieces of junk mail. The driveway remained empty. A car was parked a block away with a clear view of the house, operated by someone tasked with observing without intervening. Everything was timed, measured, and executed with the goal of one thing: exposure. The first few days passed uneventfully. Her routines didn't change: daily walks, late morning rounds, clipboard in hand, conversations with board members. Patterns tend to repeat, and so do people who rely on power. Tuesday arrived. That was the same day she had entered last time. Patterns have meaning. She followed hers. Motion detection alerts started pinging at 10:43 a.m. She approached the door calmly, like someone with nothing to hide. She reached under the flower pot, found the decoy key, and glanced around. Her hands moved without hesitation. She unlocked the door and stepped inside like she had every right. The cameras captured every second. Her expression was neutral, confident, undisturbed. She didn't creep or tiptoe. She moved like the house belonged to her. She started with the living room, open drawers, inspected framed photos, shifted objects slightly out of place. She opened a file drawer in the home office and paused to examine a document folder labeled HOA Records. The contents had been planted on purpose: fake records, harmless printouts, designed to spark interest and pull her in deeper. Scanned, then pulled out her phone and took pictures. Her voice was recorded saying, "This will do." That moment sealed her fate. She walked toward the kitchen, where she opened a cabinet, ran her hand across the counter, then peeked into the laundry area. She made no effort to conceal herself from anything because she didn't believe she was being watched. Her power had shielded her from consequences for so long. She didn't consider the possibility of accountability. By the time she reached the back of the house, Law enforcement had already been notified. The call had been placed the moment she unlocked the door. Address timestamps, camera feed, all provided in real time. Officers confirmed they were en route, approaching from the side to avoid alerting her. There was no need for confrontation, only facts. Inside, she returned to the office and lingered again at the documents. She placed a few pages inside her purse, completely unaware of how closely she was being observed. The final nail came when she whispered to herself, "He'll regret ignoring me." That sentence, captured clearly by the camera's mic, removed all doubt about her intentions. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a welfare check. This was personal. This was deliberate. This was criminal. The trap didn't rely on force. It relied on Karen's own confidence and arrogance. She walked into it voluntarily, with a key she had no legal access to. Into a house she had no right to enter, searching for leverage she could later exploit. Her downfall wasn't just recorded. It was authored by her own hand. When officers entered minutes later, they did so knowing the case was already made. The crime wasn't just entry, it was violation of trust, abuse of position, and calculated harassment. Everything Karen thought gave her immunity had turned into the rope that pulled her down. Her silence, her schemes, her sense of superiority, all captured, stored, and ready to be used against her. The plan didn't require confrontation or revenge. It only required truth and the discipline to let her reveal it herself. The arrest sent shockwaves through the entire community. Neighbors watched in disbelief as the once feared president of the HOA was escorted out of the home she had illegally entered. Word spread quickly. Phones buzzed, texts flew, and by the evening, nearly every household in the neighborhood was talking. Some were stunned. Others quietly admitted they weren't surprised. A few expressed relief. The one person who had ruled the neighborhood like a self-appointed monarch was now under investigation. It's not just for trespassing, but for multiple counts of misconduct tied to her abuse of HOA authority. The footage was irrefutable. Her voice, her actions, her presence, all captured in perfect clarity. There were no excuses to hide behind, no loopholes to exploit. The video showed her entering the home with a key she had no right to use. It showed her going through private property, removing documents, and whispering words that betrayed personal intent. The police report listed charges including criminal trespass, unlawful surveillance, and potential theft. But the damage went beyond legal consequences. It shattered the myth of her untouchability. The HOA board scrambled to contain the fallout. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Some members resigned quietly, hoping to avoid public association with the scandal. Residents who had previously stayed silent stepped forward with their own complaints. Stories emerged of harassing letters, fabricated violations, and unexplained property visits. Karen's behavior had created a climate of fear, but now that fear had a crack in its foundation, the silence that protected her was gone. Formal petitions circulated demanding her immediate removal from the HOA board. Legal advisors were brought in to evaluate the misuse of HOA resources and whether funds had been spent inappropriately during her tenure. The lockbox key she had accessed without approval became a critical piece of evidence. According to official HOA policy, emergency entry required board approval, a documented reason, and a report within 24 hours. None of those conditions had been met. Her actions violated not only the law, but the very bylaw she had weaponized against others. Homeowners began reviewing their own experiences. One family recalled being fined for having wind chimes deemed too reflective. Another remembered a violation letter about offensive garden gnomes. The pattern wasn't random, it was targeted, persistent, and designed to dominate through intimidation. Karen's presidency had turned the HOA into her personal domain. But now, with the proof laid bare, that domain was collapsing. Legal proceedings moved forward. Her lawyer attempted to argue it was a misunderstanding, a lapse in judgment, a concern for safety, but her voice in the footage, confident, calculated, and entirely without fear of consequence, destroyed any claim of innocent intent. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the surveillance evidence, pairing it with community testimonials and a pattern of prior misconduct. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was the culmination of years of unchecked authority. The civil case followed quickly. Damages were sought for emotional distress, invasion of privacy, and unauthorized entry. A restraining order was filed to prevent further contact or access to the property. It was granted without hesitation. Karen's access to any HOA property or records was immediately revoked. She was ordered to surrender her position pending legal resolution. The community, once divided by fear, now unified around accountability. HOA leadership changed hands. A temporary board was formed, including neutral homeowners and an external advisor. Transparency became the new standard. Records were audited. Meeting minutes were made public. Residents were encouraged to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. New bylaws were proposed that explicitly limited board authority over private property. The misuse of the emergency lockbox triggered the creation of a new key policy. Any access now required to board member signatures, police presence, and a written explanation delivered within 12 hours. What began as a quiet rebellion had transformed into a full-scale correction. Karen's fall became more than just personal justice, it became the catalyst for reform. Neighbors who once avoided board meetings began attending regularly. The community, long silenced by bureaucracy, started reclaiming its voice. Its were repaired without fines. Children played on the sidewalks again without fear of citations for excessive noise. Life returned to normal, but this time normal wasn't controlled by fear. It was guided by fairness. The ordeal revealed something deeper. Authority without accountability always leads to abuse. Karen had been given power not because she earned it, but because no one questioned it. Her title had masked her intentions, and her control had flourished in the absence of scrutiny. But once that mask was removed, her actions exposed a truth every homeowner understood. Respect must be mutual, and rules must serve the people, not control them. The house she entered was no longer just a victim's home, it became a symbol. A reminder that even the most entitled authority figure can't outrun truth when it's backed by proof, planning, and the will to stand up. What Karen thought would remain hidden had been brought into the light. The community had seen the truth, and it would never go back to being blind again. The verdict arrived with weight. Karen was found guilty of criminal trespass, unauthorized surveillance, and theft of private documents. The judge didn't mince words. Her position as HOA president was not a shield. It was a responsibility she had betrayed. What could have been resolved through dialogue and community trust had turned into a calculated abuse of authority. The sentence included fines, mandated restitution, probation, and mandatory community service. But even more than the legal punishment, it was the public exposure that delivered the most lasting consequence. Karen's name, once synonymous with power in the neighborhood, had become a warning. She no longer walked the sidewalks with her clipboard and smug smile. She avoided eye contact. Her once frequent visits to board meetings ceased entirely. The power she used to weaponize had been dismantled by her own actions, and the fallout followed her wherever she went. For the community, the change was more than symbolic. The HOA was transformed from an unchecked authority to a balanced system. Regular elections were enforced with fair nomination processes. Oversight committees were formed, made up of ordinary homeowners. Financial records were made publicly accessible online, allowing residents to track how every dollar was spent. Anonymous complaint systems were removed and replaced with transparent procedures that required documentation and due process. Rules had to be voted on, not dictated. Authority had to be earned, not seized. Former victims of Karen's actions found the courage to speak up publicly. They held community gatherings where people shared stories of unjust fines, property, harassment, and the mental toll of constant scrutiny. Some had lived in fear of walking on their lawns wrong or placing trash bins out a few hours too early. The psychological pressure she had enforced was real and deeply felt. Now, for the first time, there was an outlet, a place to be heard. And more importantly, to be believed. HOA trainings became mandatory. New board members were required to complete courses in conflict resolution, legal boundaries, and ethics. Guest speakers, including attorneys and former HOA abuse victims educated volunteers on what it truly meant to serve a neighborhood rather than rule over it. These weren't just reforms, they were safeguards, measures designed to ensure that no one else would be allowed to use the title of president as a means of domination again. Karen's former allies tried to distance themselves, some claiming ignorance, others pretending they had warned her. But the community had watched too long to forget. Loyalty to injustice had consequences. Those who enabled her quietly faded into the background, replaced by fresh faces committed to transparency and fairness. The HOA was no longer feared, it was respected, not because of its rules, but because of its accountability. As for the homeowner whose house she entered, peace slowly returned. The locks were changed, but so was the atmosphere. No longer did each creak in the hallway raise suspicion. The home was once again a sanctuary, not a battleground. And while the trauma couldn't be erased, it was replaced with pride, the kind that comes from standing firm, refusing to back down, and watching justice take its full course. New neighbors moving in were greeted not with HOA welcome packets, filled with veiled threats, but with community potlucks, shared tools, and friendly hellos. The reputation of the neighborhood shifted from one ruled by fear to one rebuilt by unity. Property values didn't just rise on paper, they rose in spirit. The atmosphere was different now. People no longer whispered about fines and violations. They talked openly about gardening, shared pet advice, exchanged phone numbers for emergencies, the lockbox that once granted. Karen unauthorized access was taken down permanently. In its place, a small plaque was placed at the front of the HOA. Office, power is a privilege. Respect is a right. It served as a quiet reminder of what had been endured and what had been overcome. Karen never apologized, at least not publicly. But her silence no longer mattered. The truth had spoken louder than she ever could. Her downfall had not been about revenge. It had been about reclaiming dignity, privacy, and the right to live without fear of entitlement. The real victory wasn't in seeing her arrested. It was in the restoration that followed. It was in the neighbors who felt safe again. The child who rode his scooter without getting yelled at. The couple who planted flowers without receiving a citation. The elderly resident who sat on her porch in peace. These were the victories no headline could capture, but meant more than any court ruling ever could. In the end, Karen became a chapter in the neighborhood's past, a painful one, but a necessary one. Her actions had exposed the cracks in the system, and from those cracks, real reform had taken root. What she built with fear, the community replaced with strength. No spare key would ever be misused again. No door would be opened without consent. And no one, no matter how entitled, would ever forget what happens when power goes too far.